Hello everybody, welcome to part 2 of 3 female scientists. We've done Caroline Herschel, now we're going to go on to the other 2. And the first one we'll look at is Mary Somerville. Now she's an interesting contrast with Caroline Herschel. It's fair to say most people have never heard of her. But she was famous in her day, famous enough to have an Oxford College named after her. In 1835, when the Royal Astronomical Society granted honorary membership to Caroline Herschel, and they did the same for her. So what exactly did she do to deserve it? She was a Scot, born in Jedburgh in the Borders in 1780, and brought up on the coast of Fife. Her father was an admiral who'd fought in the American War of Independence, but when the war ended, he put on half pay, so there was little money and the family lived in genteel poverty. Mary spent most of her childhood wandering the countryside amongst the birds and the flowers, or on the beach collecting shells, of which she amassed a huge collection, which is now in Somerville College. She was sent to the village school but found it disappointing. She was taught needlework and other suitable female accomplishments, but wanted more. She was taught to read, but only so she could read the Bible. Writing wasn't thought suitable for girls at all. It was unnecessary. Above all, she wanted to learn Latin, and the village dominie was persuaded to give her some lessons in the evening. "This will never do," said the admiral. She must learn to write and some arithmetic so she can keep accounts. So she was sent to a boarding school to acquire these accomplishments, but she only stayed a year, and that was the end of her formal education. Mary was a precocious child, and even in her early teens had formed strong political and religious opinions. Her father was a Tory and strongly condemned the French Revolution. Mary, like most young people, was strongly in favour, nor did she think much of her parents' Calvinist religion. "I was always a liberal in politics and religion, right from the start," she said. The family began spending their winters in Edinburgh, then at the height of its glory. Mary breathed in the intellectual atmosphere of the Scottish Enlightenment, but that wasn't why her parents had taken her there. They were trying their best to turn her into a proper young lady, capable of securing a suitable husband. For the next 5 years, Mary led a sort of double life, attending balls and behaving as the demure young girl her parents wanted her to be, while taking up painting, learning Greek, and studying mathematics and astronomy, struggling to understand Newton's Principia. Then she was introduced to Lieutenant Samuel Gregg. He was the son of the famous Admiral Gregg, who'd joined the Russian Navy and fought for Catherine the Great. Because of this connection, Samuel Jr. served as the Russian consul in London. He was someone she and her parents could agree on as a suitable match, and in 1804, at the age of 24, she married him. For the next 3 years, she lived in London, the life of a conventional married woman. She had 2 sons, and although the husband didn't actually forbid her to study, he made it clear that he didn't approve of learned women. How things would have worked out between them in the long run we don't know, because in 1807 Samuel suddenly died, cause unknown. A widow with 2 small children, she was compelled to return to her family in Scotland. This turned out to be the making of her. Her husband had left her a small inheritance, and she could afford to start studying in earnest. Mathematics became her great obsession. She started to correspond with leading maths professors, and under the pseudonym A Lady, to solve the mathematical problems that were published in the journals. For solving one particularly difficult problem using differential calculus, then rarely employed in Britain, she was awarded a silver medal. Men were intrigued by her. If female scientists were very rare, female mathematicians were almost unheard of. She was advised to study the works of the great French mathematician Laplace, who had taken the work of Newton further. She did this, and this led her to study the theory of gravity, and from there she moved into astronomy and then geography, chemistry, electricity and magnetism. She acquired a whole library of scientific books. But all this didn't mean she had no social life. In 1812 she was introduced to Dr. William Somerville, who was a distant cousin. Somerville was a distinguished man himself, currently Director of Army Medical Services, soon to be elected to the Royal Society. In 1813, at the age of 33, she married him. He was to encourage her to go on with her studies, ignoring his relations who were loudly disapproving of a married woman carrying on in that way. It was a marriage of true minds, but not just of minds, because she was to have 4 more children, 3 of which reached adulthood. She now began to move in wider social circles, not just scientific ones. She became friendly with the artist Turner, and visited his studio. Sir Walter Scott was a near neighbour, and she and William had the honour of being invited to his supper parties at Abbotsford. In 1819, William was appointed physician to Chelsea Hospital, and they moved into even loftier social circles. Mary became friendly with Lady Byron and was asked, as we'll see later, to become tutor to her daughter Ada Lovelace. She also met her fellow mathematician Charles Babbage. Babbage has become famous as the designer of what he called a difference engine, which has been called the first computer, and Somerville visited him several times whilst he was struggling to make it work. It's one of the remarkable things about Mary that despite having a busy social life, travelling all around Europe and bringing up 3 children, admittedly with the help of a German governess, she still managed to find time for original scientific research. Several papers were presented to the Royal Society in her name, although they had to be read to the members by William, as of course women were not permitted to attend meetings. Now she was approached by an organisation called the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. This much mocked institution existed to bring popular education to the masses. The founder, Lord Brougham, suggested she translate Laplace's book about how the solar system worked. She did more than simply do that. She expanded it into the first book about science, written in common language, The Mechanism of the Heavens. It was such a success that there was obviously an appetite for popular science books, so she decided to write another one. It was called On the Connection of the Physical Sciences, and came out in 1834. Its success was astonishing, selling 15,000 copies in Britain alone. The government awarded her a pension. It was the most successful science book published by John Murray before he published Darwin's Origin of Species 25 years later. It did more than that. It popularised the word science, what had previously been called natural philosophy. Mary Somerville became the first person, male or female, to be called a scientist. There was another burst of popular interest in science, stimulated by the discovery of another new planet, Neptune, in 1846. So he sat down to write another book, Physical Geography. This was a most ambitious effort. She took a very wide definition of the word geography: the Earth, its animal and vegetable inhabitants, the past and present condition of man, the origin, manners and languages of existing nations, and the monuments of those that have been. In other words, virtually an encyclopedia. Although she emphasises the superiority of mankind and doesn't challenge the orthodox Christian version of the creation, her emphasis throughout is on the dependence of man on nature and the interconnectedness of all living things. In other words, long before the word was coined, ecology. For this, she received the Gold Medal of the Royal Geographical Society. She always felt guilty about writing these books and neglecting her own mathematical research, but she couldn't stop writing another one. Published in 1869, shortly after her death, this one was called Molecular and Microscopic Science. As the title suggests, this included the latest thinking about atoms and molecules, as well as what could be discovered about plant and animal life through the microscope. Like all her books, it contained elaborate, and in this case very expensive, illustrations. William and Mary spent most of their latter years in Italy, but this didn't stop her keeping in touch with leading scientists and engaging in all the controversies of the day. She was a strong supporter of votes for women, 40 years before the suffragettes. In 1868, she was approached by the philosopher and politician John Stuart Mill to support his campaign for female suffrage. Mill had been converted to the cause of women's rights by his mistress and later wife, Harriet Taylor. He wrote The Subjection of Women, one of the first books by a male author on this subject. His aim now was to get a clause added to the second Reform Bill, then going through Parliament, to give at least some women the vote. To back it up, he organised a massive petition and asked Mary Somerville, because of her prestige, to subscribe her name first, and that she willingly did. British laws are adverse to women, she wrote. Of course, it was all futile. The House of Commons rejected the idea of women's suffrage without a vote. At the very end of her life, she became involved in the campaign for higher education for women. "Age has not abated my zeal," she wrote, "for the emancipation of my sex from the unreasoning prejudice against a literary and scientific education for women." But she was to die in 1872 before it had borne fruit. She was 91 years old and was buried in Naples. For several years after her death, she remained famous. Her autobiography was published, and in 1879, Somerville College at Oxford was founded. An island in the Canadian Arctic is named after her. Some of her books continued to be used as university textbooks into the 20th century, but gradually her renown faded. The problem was that she was chiefly known as a popularizer of science, and her books inevitably became out of date and eventually forgotten. In the later 20th century, a new generation of female scientists began to revive interest in her. Like Caroline Herschel, she's had an asteroid and a crater on the moon named after her. In her native Scotland, she's always been better remembered, and in 2016, the Royal Bank of Scotland organised a competition to decide whose portrait to put on their new £10 note. And Mary was up against two famous male Scots, James Clerk Maxwell and Thomas Telford. When the results were announced, she had won hands down. Such is immortality in the 21st century. We now come to the third of the trio of pioneer female scientists, and probably the most unlikely one, Ada, Countess of Lovelace. She was born Ada Byron, and since her ancestry is inseparable from her subsequent reputation, first we have to delve into it. The Byrons were an ancient family, supposedly of Norman origin, and landowners originally in Lancashire. In the 16th century, in the usual dubious way, they acquired, following the dissolution of the monasteries, what became their principal seat at Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire. In the 17th century Civil War, unlike some of their neighbours, the Hutchinsons for instance, they remained loyal to the crown. Sir John Byron was not just loyal, he was fanatical. After boasting in an intercepted letter that he'd massacred some civilians who supported Parliament, he became known to the Roundheads as the Bloody Braggadocio. This didn't prevent Charles I from raising him to the peerage. He became the first Lord Byron. The unsavoury reputation of the family continued into the 18th century. The fifth Lord Byron became known as the Wicked Lord, after stabbing his neighbour to death in a quarrel about the correct way to hang game. Tried before his peers in the House of Lords, he successfully pleaded that his crime was manslaughter, not murder, and was let off with a fine. Retiring to Newstead, he devoted the rest of his life to ruining the prospects of his son, an heir whom he hated. The reason for this was that the young man had defied his father by eloping with a cousin. His father considered that marriage with a close relative would bring madness into the family, assuming it wasn't there already. And anyway, he needed his son to marry a wealthy heiress so that the family debts could be paid off. For the rest of his life, the fifth Lord deliberately let the Newstead estate go to rack and ruin, cutting down all the timber and killing all the deer, and in a sense the tactic paid off because his son predeceased him. The heir to the title now became the fifth Lord's brother, Ada's grandfather. He was another chip off the same block and became known, with some justification, as Mad Jack. He was the classic 18th century rake, a philanderer and a gambler, but he managed to disguise it well enough to snare an heiress, which brought him an income of £4,000 a year, or £7 million in today's values. The heiress conveniently died, giving birth to a daughter, Augusta, who was to play an important part in Ada's story. At least she probably died giving birth, because scandalous stories began circulating that she'd actually died from ill usage at her husband's hands. Unconcerned, Mad Jack went off to Bath to see if he could find another heiress, and he did. She was a good-natured girl, a bit clumsy and rather plain, but never mind. Her name was Catherine Gordon, and she was a relative of the famous Gordon clan, and had been born in a castle in Aberdeenshire, and had plenty of money thanks to an inheritance. This was a marriage seemingly made in heaven. She desperately needed a husband, and for rather different reasons, Jack needed a wife. As soon as he married her, he began using her money, which of course he now legally controlled, to go on an orgy of spending. And within a year, he'd run through about £22,000 or $35 million. Within 18 months, he'd virtually bankrupted the estate. he was forced to flee to Paris to escape his creditors. Since she was still infatuated with him, Catherine went with him, but eventually, now pregnant, moved back to London, where Ada's father, the poet George Gordon, was born in 1788. He was born with a caul, believed at the time to be a sign of future greatness. He was also born with a club foot, which caused him pain throughout his life, but certainly never stopped him from doing anything he wanted to do. In fact, the famous Byron was become, for most of his life, in much the same way his ancestors had, behaved in much the same way his ancestors had, but because he was an artistic genius, it tended to be overlooked. In 1791, Mad Jack died of TB in Paris, bequeathing his little son responsibility for all his debts. Having little money left, Catherine moved back to Scotland, and here the poet spent most of his childhood. He was attending Aberdeen Grammar School when he learned in 1798 the Master of Newstead. Accompanied by his nanny, he went south to take possession. She wasn't the usual kind of nanny, however, since she appears to have alternated between giving him vicious beatings and sexually initiating him. If his family background hadn't ensured that he would grow up to be a somewhat unusual personality, this surely did. Sent to school at Harrow, he discovered two things: that he had a talent for poetry and that he was bisexual, and these were the two things he was to devote his life to. When he reached Cambridge, he lived extravagantly, as young noblemen were supposed to do, and was soon hopelessly in debt, and asking his impoverished mother for money, raising the rents at Newstead and telling the servants there they would have to buy their own food. Despite this, he managed to take himself off on the Grand Tour for 4 years, and it was his experiences there that led him to write the first of his masterpieces, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. When this was published in 1812, it was a sensational bestseller. In his own words, "I awoke one morning and found myself famous." He was treated as a rock star would be today. People literally fell at his feet. Women literally fell at his feet. He indulged himself with a string of affairs with people of both sexes, most famously Lady Caroline Lamb, and most notoriously with his half-sister, Augusta. And yet, he was never happy. Always in the back of his mind, he felt that he should be doing something worthwhile, taking up some noble cause. Briefly, he took up the defence of the Nottinghamshire Luddites. And then there was the problem with his debts. Byron always thought one should never accept money for writing poetry. It was vulgar. He told his publisher, John Murray, to give away the vast sum that he'd earned in royalties. But it was perfectly acceptable to pay off your debts by finding a rich heiress and using her money. And following in his father's footsteps, this is what he proceeded to do. Ada's mother, Annabella Milbank, was born in 1792, and so was 4 years younger than Byron. She came from a moderately wealthy family of landowners from Seaham in County Durham, and had a sheltered upbringing, an only child, much doted on by her parents. She was intelligent, but no great beauty, and proud and reserved in company. This wasn't promising material for the wife of the great Lord Byron. Coming down to London as a debutante in the season of 1812, she found herself surrounded by girls who were wittier, prettier, and considerably more forthcoming sexually than she was. Her family were related to the Malverns. The heir of the current Lord Malvern, William Lamb, was the husband of the notorious Lady Caroline. Annabella dined with the family. The talk was all about Lord Byron and his wonderful new poem. She soon read it and was entranced. This must have been written by a man of deep feeling, she thought. Like many other girls, she was desperate to meet him, and an opportunity soon arose at a waltzing party given by Lady Caroline. It's not clear whether she was introduced to him on this occasion, but at least she was in his company and besotted by him. Too naive to realise that he and Caroline were having an affair. He's surrounded by unworthy admirers, she thought. He needs someone like me. And indeed he did, but not for the reason she thought. Somehow they got to know each other. Whether Byron was ever attracted to her or was solely interested in her finances is not clear. In her company he appeared bored and gloomy, but this didn't put her off. Romantic heroes were supposed to behave that way. Lady Caroline sent her a drunken letter warning her off, but she didn't listen. Byron sent her a marriage proposal by letter, which he thought politic to refuse, but a correspondence began. He sent her copies of his poems. She thought he must be in love with her, not realising that he was weighing up several other wealthy candidates for his hand, as well as carrying on an incestuous relationship with Augusta. The long-distance relationship continued until 1814, when his favourite candidate for marriage finally turned him down. At this point he panicked. I couldn't exist without some object of attachment, he said, and decided he would have to marry Annabella. He sent her a letter of proposal, having okayed the wording with Augusta first, and overjoyed, this time she accepted. Having done the deed, he was in no hurry to follow it up. It was only when she mentioned that her childless uncle was visiting and might be persuaded to make her his heiress, that he hurried north. The deal was soon done, and it was purely financial. The uncle agreed to leave his will in Annabella's favour, and her father promised her a dowry of £20,000, which would go some way to pay off Byron's monstrous debts of £30,000 or 28 million. The couple were married at Seaham in January 1815. The honeymoon, spent in a snowbound country house in Yorkshire, was not very romantic. As the servants were lined up outside the house to greet them, Byron simply walked past them, not even bothering to hand his new wife down from the carriage. I had Lady Byron on the sofa before dinner, he remarked in his memoirs, and as far as he was concerned, that was that. He seemed surprised when she asked whether they were to sleep together. From a bad start, things grew worse. He took her off to stay with Augusta, and according to her later testimony, lay down on the sofa and asked the two women to take turns in embracing him. Then proceeding to compare them in gross language. Annabella didn't blame Augusta for the situation. They liked each other, became friends, even according to some people, lovers, although there's no evidence of that. And Byron occasionally showed some affection for Annabella, and it was on one of these occasions that she became pregnant. But most of the time, their relationship was of mutual torture. In December 1815, at their house in London, she gave birth to a daughter. She seemed to have been waiting for the birth to be over before leaving her husband. Early in 1816, she stole out of the house in the early morning without waking him, carrying her month-old baby, and with a single maidservant, climbed into a carriage and headed to her parents' new home at Kirby Mallory in Leicestershire. Byron was never to see her again, and destined never again to see his only legitimate child. If Annabella had thought by running away she could shield herself or the child from public attention, she was wrong. Byron was simply too famous. Everyone knew he had a daughter, and everyone was intrigued by it. Augusta, as the child was ironically named, Ada was a name thought up by her father, was to live her entire life in the glare of what would now be called the media spotlight, which makes her achievements even more extraordinary. At first, Byron was confident he would get his wife and child back, and wrote affectionate letters to Annabella, but once her parents realised the truth about his behaviour, they gradually turned their daughter against him. Then Lady Caroline weighed in. She arranged a meeting with Annabella when she told her the whole truth about the incest with Augusta and the homosexual activities at Harrow. Annabella was horrified and applied for a deed of separation. This was agreed, effectively ruining Byron. The only weapon he had left was his poetry, which he used to sneer at Annabella in the verses of Don Juan. He was forced to sell Newstead and head for the continent. The sale of the estate brought in a huge sum, and he was able to live comfortably, but he never returned to England. But he never forgot little Ada, and wrote frequently to Augusta, asking her to ask the mother how she was getting on, the colour of her hair, and so on. But Annabella was determined not only to prevent him getting anywhere near her, but to bring up the child strictly in as different a manner from the Byrons as she could possibly manage. And so Ada was destined to have a restricted and lonely childhood. Her mother was determined that she wouldn't be idle or mix much with other children. If any of her tutors or governesses threatened to get too close to her, they were promptly sacked. Her programme of education started at the age of 4 and ran to a strict timetable, stricter than if she'd been sent to school. She learnt music, French and arithmetic on a reward and punishment system. If she did well, she was given a ticket. If she did badly, this ticket was confiscated and she was locked in the closet, and so she promised to behave herself and work harder. Her mother was very keen on giving her a mathematical education, which she thought would make her completely rational and stamp out any trace of an imagination, which might tempt her to follow her father's example. It all sounds like the plot of a Dickens novel, but it was real. Not surprisingly, it left Ada with a lifetime dread of her mother, while to her mother, the sight of her daughter constantly reminded her of the mistake she'd made by her marriage. Indeed, she often referred to the child as it. "I talk to it for your satisfaction, not my own," she wrote in a letter to her own mother. "I shall be glad when you have it under your own." The only thing she could do was to try to chain Ada down and force her to be good. Ada often seems to have thought about her father and wished that she could see him, but knew better than to raise the subject with her mother. The slightest remark which seemed to allude to him would bring a savage response. Byron continued to think about her, although he now had close at hand another daughter, an illegitimate one, of course, Allegra. When Ada was 5, he sent her a lock of his hair to wear in a locket. Her mother made sure she never got it, but he did get a picture of her in return. Allegra had died by this time. When she was 7, Ada had a serious illness, and when Byron heard about this, he was very worried. Annabella actually wrote to him, assuring him the child had recovered and giving a description of her character and appearance. But there was nothing more he could do for her. Now he'd found the noble cause that he'd been searching for in the Greek struggle for independence against the Turks. In April 1824, when Ada was 8, he died, probably of flu, at Missolonghi. His death in the heroic cause had revived his reputation. His body was brought back to England, and an enormous procession followed his funeral cortege. He actually lay in state for 2 days, although he was denied burial in Poets' Corner. The attention on the dead hero inevitably brought his little daughter back into the limelight. Indeed, it was said that his last words had actually been, "Oh, my poor child, my dear Ada. My God, could I have seen her? Give her my blessing." But when he was buried at Newstead, neither Ada nor her mother were present, although Ada knew and remembered. By the time Annabella had received her uncle's inheritance, She was a wealthy woman and could begin to indulge herself, though of course not Ada. She purchased a large country house in Kent, into which they moved. At the same time, perhaps not coincidentally, she became increasingly worried about her health. This was probably a hypochondria, but she spent increasing amounts of time at various spas and seaside resorts. So from the age of 10, Ada was often left alone with her governess, her various tutors, and her cat, Puff, the only real friend she had. She had to write a long letter to her mother each day, telling her in detail what she'd been up to, interspersed with suitably pleasing observations like, "I think it well for me that I am not beautiful." With her father safely dead, Annabella could risk taking Ada on a grand tour of the continent. They visited the Alps and Italy, the very places where her father had once been. She enjoyed sketching the scenery and playing and listening to music. She speculated she might become a singer. She dreamed of being able to fly and speculated on how you might build a flying machine. All this was alarming to her mother. She was showing dangerous signs of imagination. It must be stamped out with even more rigorous education. But all this rigour almost had disastrous consequences. When she was 13, she was struck down by a severe attack of measles. She was left paralysed, in bed for almost a year, and then in a wheelchair. Gradually, she learned to walk again, at first with the aid of crutches. These years changed her. Her education continued, and she became more focused, more sure of what she wanted, much more sure of what she wanted to do. This should have pleased her mother, because what she wanted to do was mathematical. But Ada, having entered her teenage years, her mother had a new fear. It was her daughter's moral welfare she was now concerned about. She recruited a group of friends to keep an eye on Ada, essentially to spy on her when she was away on a rest cure. Ada hated these people, who she called the Furies, but they were apparently blind when she started a love affair with one of her tutors. It got as far as the young couple eloping together. Unfortunately, they chose to stay in the house of the young man's parents, who recognised her and told her mother. She was brought home in disgrace. It was at this point that Lady Byron, as Annabella still called herself, decided to ask Mary Somerville for advice and perhaps to act as her tutor. Mary realised that a different approach was needed and introduced Ada to some of her scientific friends. In particular, she introduced her to Charles Babbage. It was a fateful meeting. Babbage was over 40, a wealthy widower, when he met Ada. She was 17. Recognised by everyone as a brilliant man, a Fellow of the Royal Society, he had so far achieved relatively little. He was best known as an astronomer, working alongside John Herschel, the son of William and the nephew of Caroline. He was also a mathematician, compiling actuarial tables for the insurance industry. This was a monumental task, and he asked himself whether there was an easier way to do it. Suppose you could mechanise it, in the same way that industrial processes were mechanised. This would be much faster and probably more accurate. You could automate the whole process, only needing one man to turn a handle to start it operating. Or you could dispense with the human factor altogether and get a small steam engine to power the process. All the labour and difficulty of compiling astronomical, nautical or logarithmic tables would disappear. Babbage set out to create such a machine. For 12 years he worked on it, persuading the Duke of Wellington to give him a government grant, and in 1832, just before he met Ada, he and a team of workmen succeeded in building what he called his difference engine, and this is now in the Science Museum. A fantastically elaborate mechanism, 2 feet high, built of bronze and steel and capable of simple mechanical calculations with numbered cogwheels. When she met him, Ada was entranced. Babbage was not just a scientist, he was a showman, loving to boast of the future capabilities of his machine. There was something of the mad scientist about him, and he was often invited to fashionable soirees where he could be guaranteed to entertain the guests. He was charmed by Ada, calling her Lady Fairy. He invited her to visit him, to see his machine, and chaperoned by her mother, she did. Another lady who was present said she looked at the machine like a savage who'd never seen a looking glass before. It opened all sorts of exciting possibilities in her mind. She and Babbage were on the same wavelength from the start, but there was no way she could devote herself to science in the same way he did. She was a lady of fashion. By 1834, still in her teens, she was received at court. Everyone was anxious to meet her, the daughter of the great Byron, and suitors were soon appeared. Most of them were not quite suitable, her mother feared. Annabella was determined to find a husband for her, for a daughter who would keep her on the straight and narrow, and in 1835 she thought she'd found one. William, Lord King, was 30 years old, impeccably aristocratic, enormously wealthy, but also reasonably intelligent. He and Ada were introduced and hit it off. How much she loved him is debatable, but he was certainly acceptable, and marrying him would enable her to escape from her mother's clutches. In 1836 they were married, and she moved into the huge Jacobean mansion he owned in Surrey, Ockham Park. Her nickname for him was the Cock, and soon, as she put it, the hatching had commenced. Her first son was called significantly Byron, quickly followed by a daughter, Annabella, and another son. By that time, she'd become the dominant partner in the marriage. William was an aimless man, willing enough to go along with his wife's ideas. His chief interest in life was building tunnels under his various houses. They led nowhere and were for no discernible reason. His other interest was trying to revive the ancient earldom of Lovelace, which had once belonged to Ada's relatives. On the accession of Queen Victoria, he succeeded, and Ada became a countess. She wasn't really interested in such things. She was increasingly bored and irritated by her husband. It was mathematics and the life of the mind concerned her. Chaperoned by her mother or Mary Somerville, she continued to meet Babbage and invited him to Ockham. More importantly, she started to write to him. Their correspondence went on for the rest of her life, and there's little doubt he was the man she should have married, but the differences in age and class made this impossible. Babbage was no businessman. He made no attempt to market his difference engine or find out whether his demonstration piece would work in the real world. Instead, he was now onto another, grander project. He'd got hold of a jacquard loom, a French invention designed for the weaving of silk. It used a system of punched cards and was far in advance of anything available in Britain. Babbage saw the possibilities of using such a system for advanced mathematical calculations, something much closer to a modern computer. He called the idea the analytical engine. Ada was so excited, was as excited as he was, but felt her mathematical skills not up to helping him. Her mother found her a tutor, a friend of Babbage called Augustus de Morgan, Under his tuition, she progressed enormously, too much so for De Morgan. He became alarmed. After all, she was only a woman. Everyone knew that women were temperamentally unsuited to mathematics, and she could never equal the capabilities of a man. Ada had different ideas. Meanwhile, Babbage was being increasingly distracted by his role as a host at intellectual soirees. Everyone who was anybody in the 1840s turned up at one of these. Charles Dickens and Prince Albert, to name but two. Babbage hoped that these influential people would land him a government grant to continue his researches, but without any luck. His interview with the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, was a disaster. He rubbed Peel up entirely the wrong way. Like most politicians, Peel had no interest or knowledge of science and basically didn't know what Babbage was talking about. All he knew was that the government had given him a lot of money in hard times and had nothing to show for it. "We might have built 2 frigates for the Navy with that," he said. But Ada did know what he was talking about and was now ready and anxious to help him, and she'd found a way to do so. She'd come across an article in an obscure journal written by an Italian mathematician, Menabrea. Menabria's article was an examination of the possibilities of Babbage's proposed analytical engine. She decided to translate it. To the translation, Ada added her own notes, 3 times the length of the original article. The whole thing was published under the initials AM because, of course, it would never have been taken seriously if people knew it was by a woman. The notes are now seen as a major turning point in the development of information technology. In demonstrating how the proposed machine could be made to calculate numbers, she'd created what was, in effect, the first computer program. Even more remarkably, and going far beyond Babbage himself, she was the first person to suggest that what we now call a computer didn't only need to be used to calculate numbers. It could be used for anything in life, so long as that could be expressed in mathematical terms, digitized in modern terminology. But Babbage was curiously uninterested in the long-term implications of his engine, or even whether it would ever be built. Always more practical, Ada wrote him a long letter offering further help in what would now be called public relations, selling his ideas to others and raising funding. Babbage was a stubborn character and turned her down. His analytical engine, the enchantress of numbers as he called it, was destined never to be built, although modern scientists calculate that using Ada's program, it would have been an entirely feasible project. Although they continued friends and indeed visited the Great Exhibition together, it was the end of their close cooperation. Ada turned to other scientific interests. Through her friendship with Michael Faraday, she became interested in the possibilities of electricity. Like many people in the period, she was interested in phrenology, solving the mysteries of the human mind by feeling the bumps on people's heads. On another level, she developed a mania for horse racing and lost a lot of money gambling, bringing money worries in her later years. There was also a rift with her mother, caused by William and her decision to visit Newstead. The revelation that she was still interested in her father and felt an affinity with him was something her mother would never forgive. In 1851, Ada's health began to decline. She laughed it off at first, but it grew worse. She was in the first stages of uterine cancer. She did her best to kill the pain by dosing herself with laudanum. William, unable to do anything for her, seems to have kept away. Her mother came back to suggest she try mesmerism, all to no avail. As it became obvious she was dying, she received one last visit from Babbage. Dickens came to her bedside to read her the death scene from Dombey and Son. The new drug, chloroform, was used on her to try and relieve the pain, but she died in November 1852, aged only 36, the same age as her father. She was laid to rest in the same tomb as him in Hucknall Church. Even in death, she couldn't escape the Byron legacy. Her mother survived her by 3 years before she too died of cancer. Her husband married again and had another family. Ada was never to be forgotten, but solely because of the Byron connection. Her work, and Babbage's, was forgotten almost entirely. It was only when the computer became a reality in the 1940s and 50s that pioneers like Alan Turing began to study their predecessors. Babbage was rediscovered, and through him, Ada. Now, in an unlikely turn of events, she's become an iconic figure for female scientists, rather overshadowing Babbage himself. She's featured in numerous books and plays. There's an Ada Lovelace Medal and even an Ada Lovelace Day. Now, women scientists of that era are given a respect they never enjoyed in their own lifetimes, which would certainly have amazed their menfolk. That concludes Three Male Scientists. We'll be back in the autumn now in some way or another. Thank you.